Darwinism, then, could be reasonably accommodated into Christian thinking, and neither Darwin nor his ardent defender Huxley ever dreamed of overturning, let alone demolishing, established religion. However, Darwin's theory did appear to ask questions about the origins of morality and the maintenance of social order. Both of these issues were dealt with in The Descent of Man, and Darwin suggested that they had an evolutionary origin. But Anglicanism seemed to be able to take what it wanted from Darwin and accommodated his ideas with an almost unseemly rapidity. Indeed, it was easy enough for a member of the Church of England to believe in a superadded God above a natural biological process. But it was much harder for the churches that were fundamentally evangelical and believed that the Word of God was enshrined in the pages of the Bible, biblical literalism. For these congregations, principally to be found in the USA, everything from Genesis to Revelations was the truth with a capital T.
Here there was no room for accommodation, only resistance. Yet at the same time the responses of these churches was complex and occasionally equivocal. Indeed, if we compare the early part of the 20th century with the latter, it is remarkable how time's arrow appears to have been reversed. The most forthright of contemporary creationists, think Comfort and Cameron, would have appeared embarrassing and unsophisticated to their earlier counterparts. In fact, before 1925, creationism embraced a whole range of different perspectives. Outright theism, the idea of a designer-builder but non-interventionist God. Progressive creationism, which included day-age theory, the idea that each day in Genesis actually represented millions or even billions of years. Gap theory, the idea that each creation happened rapidly but was separated by huge gaps. And catastrophism, successive catastrophes resulting in whole-scale natural destruction, followed by acts of special creation. And then, of course, outright literalism. The word is the word is the word. Each involved at least a partial rejection of Darwinism, although in the case of literal creationism, the rejection was total. And in the early part of the 20th century, no progressive creationist was more important than William Jennings Bryan, the charismatic, thrice unsuccessful Democratic presidential nominee, and one of the two lawyers at the centre of the Scopes monkey trial. Jennings was concerned with the moral implications of Darwinism than whether evolution occurred with or without a designer. Indeed, during the First World War, he was deeply influenced by the journalist Vernon Kellogg's account of the German High Command. Headquarters Nights, a record of conversations and experiences at the headquarters of the German army in Belgium and France. Kellogg had visited the headquarters and conversed widely with the High Command. In these conversations, he was able to document the dog-eat-dog, or rather Germany eat the world, ideology of social Darwinism, which appeared to have infected the collective psyche of the commanders of the German army and their political masters. To Bryan, this indicated the moral dangers of Darwinism, an issue that will be dealt with in further lectures. And from that point onwards, he dedicated himself to countering the spread of Darwinian theory in schools, universities, and even in some of the more progressive churches. And so to the monkey trial. In 1925, the state of Tennessee outlawed, through the Butler Act, the teaching of evolution in schools. The American Civil Liberties Union responded predicted as the voice of progressive politics and an organization dedicated to upholding the constitutional rights of all US citizens, including not allowing religion into the classroom. It orchestrated a test case which would be headed up by the lawyer Clarence Darrow. Searching around for the right scapegoat, they found a volunteer in the Dayton substitute teacher John T. Scopes. Scopes, having volunteered, duly stood up, having publicised the fact that he'd be teaching Darwinian theory in the classroom, and to nobody's surprise was arrested and prosecuted. With two lawyers, both of whom possessed an extraordinarily high profile, it rapidly came down to the Bryan versus Darrow show. Now, despite the fact that it was the state of Tennessee that was prosecuting Scopes, it was William Bell Riley's World Christian Fundamentals Association that sought out Bryan and paid his retainer. Riley was known as the grand old man of fundamentalism. He had set up the WCFA to promote biblical literalism, affiliating doctrinally sympathetic organisations to his organisations. Later on, he would edit the magazine The Christian Fundamentalist, and he was deeply influential upon the next generation of literal evangelicals like Billy Graham. It was theatre, pure theatre, as two opposing, nay incommensurable viewpoints waged war upon each other. The world's press, the fundamentalist antagonists of Darwinism, as well as the supporters of secularism and the Constitution, descended upon Dayton. It was a veritable media event. Darrow, playing to the gallery, took the extraordinary step of placing Bryan upon the stand, whereupon he cross-examined his opponent about his biblical views. At one point, Darrow asked Bryan when the flood had occurred. Bryan went to his authority, Archbishop Usher's Bible Concordance, written, you might recall, by the 17th century Archbishop, who dated the age of the earth by counting the generations of begats in the Bible, and had come up with the date of the 24th of October, or thereabouts, 4004 BC, for the final act of God's creation. Now Usher had dated the flood at 2348 BC, or 4273 years before the trial. Darrow, with a flourish, pointed out that written Chinese records could be dated back 7,000 years. He may have been a hero to Riley's organisation and other sympathisers, but the evidence allowed northern sophisticates like the journalist H.L. Mencken to ridicule Bryan as a southern ignoramus. No doubt Darrow felt the only chance of winning this case lay in this out-and-out gimmickry, but it came as no surprise that in the end Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. On appeal, this was overturned. It would be easy to interpret the overturning of the Scopes conviction as a defeat for creationism, but this was most definitely not the case. It was like a warning shot fired across the bows of a ship. It made teachers wary, and perhaps even the teaching of evolution in the classroom a little bit more furtive. School textbooks would hedge their bets. There was a fear, no doubt, of the forces of fundamentalist reaction. Do we see this as a harbinger of things to come? The answer must be equivocal. Yes and no. The creation movement, for want of a better word, evolved into the intelligent design movement, but in the process it tried its hardest to hide its creationist roots, pursuing instead the idea that it was committed to a mainstream vision of science. The evolution of creationism into intelligent design took about a decade. The first thing that had to be done was the marginalisation of young Earth creationism, which attempted to use science to validate the Usher calendar. A landmark of young Earth creationism was John C. Whitcomb's The Genesis Flood, the Biblical Record, which attempted to use geology to validate Genesis and to demolish progressive creationist models like the Day Age and Gap theories. Of course, geologists and other scientists ridiculed Whitcomb's work, but within fundamentalist circles it created a sensation, selling over 100,000 copies. It was a catalyst to further research and provided a stimulus to attempting to reintroduce the teaching of creationism in schools. On the back of this, the Creation Research Society was founded in 1963 to promote flood geology. It developed its mission further, extending its reach into biology with a textbook published in 1970, Biology, A Search for Complexity. While the book sold many copies, it found few takers in the public school system. Nevertheless, this strategy would be pursued over the next 3 decades by proponents of intelligent design, with an effort increasingly to hide creationism behind a veneer of science. The intelligent design movement as it emerged during this period definitely took a more subtle approach than its predecessors. On the face of it, ideologically, it might seem like good old-fashioned natural theology propounded by Comfort. However, this is not the case. In the vast majority of cases, the designer is never specified, his work hardly glorified. He sits there in the background, mostly unmentioned. Instead, the aim has been to develop scientific arguments that challenge evolution, in particular the notion of irreducible complexity, which, defined by Michael Bay, states a single system which is composed of several well-matched parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. In other words, the particular system is so complex that evolution cannot explain its existence. And for many ID researchers, the eye is a totemic example of irreducible complexity. And then there was William Dembski's specified complexity, of which DNA was a prime example. Specified complexity states that something as complex as the DNA code has only a very small chance of occurring or evolving naturally. So small that conscious design provides a far better explanation for its existence. Both of these theories, however, were couched in scientific language and ostensibly appeared to emerge out of a research program, the proponents of which maintained that they adhered to the scientific method, some form or other of hypothesis formation and hypothesis testing within a laboratory context. This was the basis of the strategy to get ID in the classroom. It challenged mainstream evolutionary science because, they maintained, it adhered to the scientific method, and this adherence made it scientific. The push to get ID into the classroom has met several challenges. For as we've seen, no sooner does a state or a school board introduce alternative biological explanations to neo-Darwinism than a challenge is raised by organisations like the American Civil Liberties Union, who back any individual who seeks to overturn the policy of creation-influenced educators. This has led to some landmark cases that in the process have attempted to define what exactly science is from a legal perspective. We could almost say that science was being made in the courtroom. In Arkansas in the early 1980s, the state had legislated for balanced treatment of evolution and creationism in the classroom, with the soon-to-be familiar mantra that evolution was theory, not fact, and that creationism was an equally valid way of explaining the existence of the universe. A group of parents and other interested parties, including, it has to be said, a number of religious organisations, challenged the state on the grounds that it violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which laid down the separation of the church from state and therefore precluded the teaching of any one religious position within public schools. But because of the attempts of the design lobby to obfuscate its true intentions, keeping as quiet as possible about the creator, the issue of what was and was not science became critical. Expert witnesses were brought in to help the court resolve this issue. Michael Ruse, one of the principal philosophers of biology, who made his career in studying Darwinism as science, was brought in as an expert witness, and he laid down a set of principles against which science could be demarcated from pseudoscience. Science, he maintained, and the judge, Overton, accepted this, is guided by natural law, has to be explanatory by reference to natural law, is testable against the empirical world, its conclusions are tentative, in other words, are not necessarily the final word, and in good Popperian style, that it is falsifiable. Creation science failed upon every single measure. 1987 saw a rerun of the issues when the state of Louisiana passed a similar law to Arkansas. In this instance, Governor Edwards was taken to court. The outcomes were not dissimilar to the Arkansas case, although the ruling left open the issue of alternative models of scientific explanations. As the judgment read, teaching a variety of scientific theories about the origins of humankind to school children might be validly done with a clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science instruction. In other words, if ID could be solved almost completely without God, then it could find a place in the classroom. The result was the volume of Pandas and People, released in 1989, which talked about design but not a designer. And of course, a term like design is slippery. It could infer a designer, but it could also be just a teleological slip of the tongue, something that we all fall into. We've already discussed Kitzmiller et al. Versus Dover schools, and we can see how neatly it fits into the pattern described. However, one thing I did not allude to was the role of the sociologist Steve Fuller in giving expert witness on behalf of the defence, Dover schools. Fuller's position appeared to devolve from his full-bore belief in the constructedness of science, which meant that science itself could never live up to the lofty ideals of Rous's definition. Nevertheless, in summarising the case, and finding for Kitzmiller et al., Judge Jones managed to use Fuller's evidence to demonstrate the unscientific nature of the designer's case. This
This is not an issue that is going to go gently into the dark night. At least it won't do in the United States. There will always be people who deny Darwin's ideas and the tenets of neo-Darwinism. Ultimately, those that have faith will not have their faith shaken. However, the flip side of this is whether Darwin's ideas have the potential to kill God, as Dawkins and his supporters maintain, and whether, as Dawkins appears to believe, Darwinism is completely incompatible with religious belief. And that, of course, is another matter entirely.